very good from over here. I was.
She has.
She originally from Iowa.
Oh, really? Huh?
No, Midwesterners, University of Iowa.
Yeah.
Tourist cruise.
And the lens that I suppose I should direct my attention to is the big round thing.
Well, yeah, actually, if you look at me, that's what my left ear is going to be.
Okay, all right.
Then we got this system worked out where if you look at me and talk
That's
to me,
good enough.
You'll relax and pretty soon you're getting it.
Yeah, sure. That's easy. Looking at you is easier than looking at the lens.
Yeah. To start, the first question is, hi, kitty cat. The first question is, your start. I mean, what was your first encounter with wine?
Okay. I'm Cornelius Peck, and I know you're interested in wine. It may seem like a strange story, but I first made wine with my father during Prohibition. That was back in the state of Michigan, and it wasn't very good wine, and he didn't make a great deal of it. But he was of German ancestry and had an interest in wine, and I can remember, because I was sort of surprised as a child, to see these packets that my father got of grape concentrate that described, put it in with so much water and so much sugar, and then it said, caution, do not expose to yeast, or it will turn into wine, which is illegal. And I saw my father doing exactly what was said to be illegal. Apparently there were some of the California wineries that went even further than that and sent along with it a little packet of the kind of yeast you should particularly avoid. Actually, though, I think my parents during those years did much more in the way of brewing home beer at home, homebrew. I think my interest in wine developed when, in 1948, I went to France with the experiment in international living and lived with two French families, 2 weeks with each of the families, and other time traveling. And then when my wife and I were married, we lived in Washington, D.C., which at that time was a great wine city, wonderful array of French and all European wines, and we got to like them very much. And one of my thoughts when we came here in 1954, when I joined the faculty of the School of Law at the University of Washington, was that I might become able to make wine. Back in the District of Columbia, my interest in brewing things got me to making mead, apple mead, but that was not the success that I wanted. And when I was here, then I learned that Lloyd Woodburn was a home winemaker whom I should get in touch with, and I did. And I think that the first time that I made wine here in Seattle was in 1956. I'm quite sure of that because that's when the year when my oldest child was born. And that batch didn't turn out well because having a new baby, I wasn't able to spend the amount of time that I should. But by 57, I got around to doing it much better.
And you were making it alone yourself?
Yes, well, what we would do in those days was, there were a number of people who were interested in winemaking, and we would go down to the Georgetown siding where railroad cars of grapes came in, and some Italian families would sell the grapes. And the Zinfandel was the best grape that we could get down there. Lloyd Woodburn had made contact with people in the Yakima Valley, and we were able to get a Delaware grape to use for making wine. The Delaware is the principal grape in New York State Champagne. And interestingly enough, it's called Delaware simply because it was discovered in Delaware, Ohio, and no one really knows what its ancestry is. But it's a very good, flavorful grape. They usually cut it down with about 1/2 Thompson seedless wine, which is tasteless and odorless, and then it turns out to be a fairly good white wine. Over a period of time, we learned, Lloyd Woodburn and others, but I think primarily Lloyd, learned of a man named Bridgman, this person we should meet. And Bridgman was an early experimenter with the vinifera in the Yakima Valley. And indeed, I think one of the reasons why we have not had the phylloxera in this state is that Bridgman was in the state legislature for a while, and he got the enactment of a statute requiring that all grape cuttings coming into the state of Washington be fumigated. And I think that's still the law, and it's still in operation. And of course, that's wonderful that we can grow the vinifera on their own roots in this state. Well, Bridgman had at various times planted grapes in a number of areas. He told us where they were, and he had retired from operating the vineyard, but his daughter and son-in-law ran the Upland Vineyard, which furnished the grapes for the Santa Rosa Winery. And my recollection is that there on the Upland Vineyard he had Semillon and Riesling, and not the Cabernet Sauvignon, but Ruby Cabernet, which we bought and tried out. And then Bridgman told us that there were Pinot Noir grapes planted in land now then owned by Nauwico Pomerel. They had not been doing anything special with the Pinot Noir. We offered to buy it, offer them something of a premium, so they sold it to us, and we...
Do you remember what the premium price would have been then, just for curiosity?
No, I don't know. Now, I'm sure very low price.
Probably $50.
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, it wasn't, that Pinot wasn't being raised properly then, and I don't think, one of the things we were quite convinced of was that none of those grapes that we were getting had been raised properly. That is, I mean, they were overcropped. They produced altogether too many tons per acre. But nonetheless, we could make a decent wine out of them.
Did you make then both reds and whites?
Yes, yeah. Well, the Ruby Cabernet was a pretty rough wine, but it had some resemblance to a Cabernet. It was one that I think was a hybrid developed to get by on a little lower heat budget than the Cabernet Sauvignon. Well, I guess what we would do would be take the red grapes that we had to our homes. We'd meet 1 or 2 weekends at Lloyd Woodburn's house over in Laurelhurst and get the Delaware or any other white grapes we had and crush and press them there, inoculate them, and then divide the juice up and take it back to our various homes in 5-gallon carboys. The law then was, and I think it still is, that you can get a home wine permit, but you're not allowed to make wine in partnership. Each person had to make wine at his own home. And when that's the federal law. And when I say his, I mean his, because the rules at that time were very sexist. Only a male head of a household could get the permit to make the wine. And well, that's the way we operated, and this group got together and knew one another and enjoyed doing the crushing, pressing, and then meeting later to taste the wine that we produced. And ultimately we decided that we should plant a vineyard of our own.
What's unusual about it, isn't it, that usually winemaking or beer making is a solitary pursuit, for a home beer or winemaker. But you were unified then by the crushing and the purchasing processes.
That's right.
Well, together. That was fortuitous, wasn't it?
Yes, it was not only the matter of getting together to crush. I should say, after we finished pressing and getting the white juice, we'd pick up the crusher and go around from house to house and crush the grapes in each other's garages.
Like the French do with making their wine.
And it was, it was a lot of fun, and also not only taste one another's wine, but talk about what you're learning in the process of making the wine, and you get some judgment also of who knows how to do it right and who's having trouble. Enough of us got to the enthusiasm, so we decided what we'd like to do would be plant our own vineyard.
Is that when the famous 10 got together?
Yes. Well, that's right. I think it was 1952 that I drew up the, no, I beg your pardon, 1962, that I drew up the Articles of Incorporation for Associated Vintners. That's what I called it, because we were Associated Vintners. Mm-hmm. And that's still the corporate name for Columbia Winery.
I'm sure.
Actually, we first started with only 8 of the 10, but the next year we got Charles Schlenker and Don Bevan, who were devoted winemakers, to join the group. And Lloyd Woodburn and I think were the ones who did most of the traveling over to eastern Washington looking for a vineyard land. But, well, I was saying I ride a bicycle to and from the university to the law school every day, even during the winter, and the weather is really much better than Seattle's reputation gives it, because it only takes about 5-7 times that I have to have the car or have my wife come and pick me up or take me there. I taught 1 year at Stanford. I lived about the same distance away, got a bicycle down there, and I had to have the car many more times there, because when it rains down there, it means it. And not this nice, gentle drizzle. It comes down around here.
Too bad you couldn't raise vinifera down on the side of it. But
that's a wrong slope.
Yeah.
I had that in mind, don't worry. Well, I'm going to our desire to plant a vineyard of our own. I think I should mention that one of the original 10, whom I think was very, very important, and certainly one of the most dedicated of the winemakers, was Phil Church. He's now deceased. He was then head of atmospheric sciences at the university. And he was able to give us very, very close comparisons of climate in the Yakima Valley to the climates in Europe. And the story of how he got to be so expert is an interesting one. At the beginning of World War II, he was a new member of the atmospheric sciences faculty here. He was off on field work measuring the temperature of the water of Lake Michigan at various depths, when he got a telephone call and told him to get back here, that they had a special project he was to carry out for the Army. And he came back, and he wasn't told what the project was about, but it turned out that the Army wanted to know everything about which way the wind blows around the Tri-Cities area. At different levels, what are the temperatures, and so on. And that's the study he made, and he was able to tell us that the growing days, the temperature degree days at Sunnyside, Washington, are within 2 or 3 temperature degree days of Bon-France in the middle of the Burgundy region, and only slightly away from the Bordeaux region. And that's much closer than the Napa Valley in California, for which is so famous. When we get into these things, I like to tease Californians who make the mistake of asking if you can really grow decent grapes this far north, by telling them about that comparison of temperatures. And then I say, by the way, did you know that your famous Napa Valley is on an Algerian latitude? Of course, yes, sure it is. Of course, I've met a few smart Californians who thought about that for a moment and then said, yes, and you're on the same latitude as Montana. It tells you that it takes more than latitude to do it. But latitude is important, because during the growing season over there in the Yakima Valley, we have, I think, at least 2 hours of daylight more than they have down in the Napa Valley. And that's very important, because the thing that you need to produce really good wine grapes is enough heat to produce the sugar, but not so much heat as to destroy the acidity. And when you're getting light from the side, as you do in the early morning hours and late evening hours and late afternoon hours, photosynthesis can still go on, but it's not baking at a temperature that will destroy the acidity. And that's really a very great factor for the future of Washington wine.
Did you and Church and others anticipate that about that area when you...
Oh yeah, well that's Phil Church could give us the exact comparisons. As a matter of fact, one of the wonderful things he did, it may be somewhere in our archives, I don't have it right now, but I remember roughly that he compared Sunnyside to Europe, and at the beginning of the growing season, he said the closest comparison was the Rhineland. And then we began to move south, and we got to the Burgundy region. And then for a while we got down to, in August, down to the Rhone, lower Rhone, and then started moving back up again into... Phil had an enormous amount of data. And
the best of all seasons, so
yeah.
to speak.
Yeah, well, and that was also important for us in deciding which kind of grapes we should plant. We knew what we should look to in Europe for the models of the grapes we wanted to plant. But at the time that we planted that, well, I should say we bought our vineyard, I should mention that. We bought 5.5 acres of land from William Bridgman, the one whom I mentioned. It was a part of the upland that he had not developed. It also was right on the city limits of Sunnyside, with a beautiful slope to the south.
Is it still in...
It's still in, you know, it's still being used. I think it ought to be a state or national shrine, but it's there. I think I can give you some idea of how little was known about making good wine in Washington at the time we started this by telling you of the number of grapes we planted on just 5.5 acres, the varieties we planted. I'll go around with my memory of what the vineyard was like. And we had the Johannesburg Riesling, we had the Gewürztraminer, we had what we thought was Chardonnay until it came out, and then we learned that the person who raised the cuttings for us had mixed them up with some other horrible thing, and so we ended up having to rip those out and put real Chardonnay in place, but that meant we didn't have Chardonnay at the beginning. And then we had Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, Chenin Blanc, and Grenache Rosé. And I tell you, it doesn't make any sense to plant that many varieties of grapes on 5.5 acres. But we knew what we were doing. We were going to find out which ones did well. And we learned pretty rapidly that the Grenache Rosé was altogether too susceptible to frost and to freezing. And we pulled those out. And when we first made wine...
did you have a vineyard manager at that time?
Oh, yeah. Bill Barnard was the Bridgman's son-in-law.
Okay.
Operated as our vineyard manager for, probably the first 5 to 7 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. We planted the first vineyard in 1962.
You were using California spacing and techniques, probably.
Yeah, and rivulet irrigation, and the wire and post and wire trellising for the grapes. Let me be sure I get this right. Yeah, we planted the vineyard in '62. We're going to get our first half crop in '65, and then we learned something painfully about the climate over there, and that is there were those grapevines, and they were going to start out. They looked like they were going to do very well until December of '64, when there was a hot spell, and the juice came up into the canes, and then the temperature dropped precipitously, and the vines split. And then, yeah, just about every one of them would split. In short, it just ruined any half crop that we were counting on getting in 65. So
you didn't have much of a root structure in 3 years.
Well, they came back, and in 66, we got our first crop, half crop, and took it home and made wine. Some of the people who were in the venture had gone along with it simply as an idea of having a good supply of grapes for home winemaking. Lloyd Woodburn, Phil Church, and I think, always had in mind, unless maybe there'll be also a winery coming out of this.
That's one of my questions.
Yeah.
So in other words, you did have in the back of your mind.
Oh, yeah, sure. And I think maybe we knew we were conducting an experiment, and when we got the grapes here, we made each variety separately to test it out. And I'll tell you, it was a thrilling time, because this time we had the grapes finally produced without overcropping, that is, keeping the tonnage down to an appropriate level. I think Bill Barnard found it a little bit hard to cut them back as much as we wanted, but he did it, and did it very well.
Were you in the, well, of course, this was early crop.
Yeah,
Full crop anyway.
No. But it, well, I guess Barnard, I'd say later on, was having more of this problem of why were we foregoing all those nice grapes we could get if we only let the vines produce a few more.
Remember what your target tonnage was per acre at that time?
Oh, we started about 4 tons to an acre, and didn't always get it. Sometimes got 5 tons, sometimes less, depends on the weather and other things.
But you short cropped it pretty.
Yeah. And we, well, I was going to say, after we made our wine at home, we were pretty excited about it, because even though it wasn't aged or mature, we knew we really had something. And so the next year, we went commercial.
That would have been
67. Yeah. And in 67, we looked around for a place to locate the winery, and Lloyd Woodburn, Phil Church, and I think, did most of the looking. I think Lloyd and I really did more than Phil Church, but we finally found a spot over in Kirkland in Parmack Industrial Park where they were willing to put up a new building for us. And it was a crazy little building, 40 feet by 40 feet. That's not much of a building. But we moved in, we bought barrels and other equipment, and got ready to produce our first wine.
That cooperage, was that European cooperage?
No, not at that time. Well, no, wait, some of it. So we got the barrels from Sweeney Cooperage, which used to be in operation here. I think they're now withdrawn and everything is up in Canada. But Sweeney Cooperage had some barrels that had been used for Portuguese port, I think, which had been reconditioned. And as I remember, we had, in those days, the alcohol and tobacco tax people were very concerned about what was the capacity of each thing, and we measured them out to be 67 1/2 gallons per barrel. The rest of it, the greater part of it, was American oak barrels that had been used to store whiskey. And Sweeney Cooperage had a process of renewing those barrels, shaving off the insides of the barrels so that there was none of the bourbon taste left. And then we filled them with water and let them soak during the summer, and kept tasting the water to make sure that there was no bourbon taste to it. And so the American oak barrels were a very big part of our first part vintage. I think our first vintage was probably only about 3,500 gallons of wine altogether. Again, each one made separately 100% of the variety that it was.
Did all 10 of you take their portions and make?
Well, when that happened, we put everything out there. No more home.
When you moved in, then?
No more home wine making.
Right, okay, so you
And
were limited partners
Yeah.
then in it.
Yeah, well, I'm actually not legally limited partners, shareholders.
Sure.
But I think one of the things I should say is that we operated without any income and without a great amount of money. And the way we did it was that we kept track of the hours that we worked and paid ourselves in stock on the basis of the number of hours we'd worked. And people were very good at that. I think one of the main reasons why we were able to succeed so underfinanced was the tremendous group of people we had with such a variety of talents. Charles Schleicher's a chemical engineer. Don Bevan was then Dean of Fisheries, but he was very knowledgeable about food and food processing and so on. Al Taylor was a production engineer at Boeing. He knew how we should set things up and so on. And as I said, Phil Church was there with plenty of advice on climate and grape varieties. And the rest of us, I suppose, well, Warren Bierman was a medical doctor. I think sometimes not quite as much as Charles Schleicher, but his scientific background could come in. And I'm a lawyer. I'd say the situation was such that there wasn't a single question that came up that would otherwise have required hiring a specialist or an expert for advice that we couldn't do a pretty good job on from one of our group, and that's the way we operated.
And you were all experienced winemakers.
Oh, yes, yeah, sure.
So, and you hadn't adverted to any other help at this point, had you?
No. We did it all by ourselves, primarily on weekends. My wife Gloria and other women used to complain that they were wine widows because we'd disappear. Yeah, and of course that wasn't only during vintage time. We had to go out and top off the barrels every week. We were going to really do this in a precise fashion, and when you put wine in a barrel, it ages, but it also evaporates out through the wood. And if you don't top it, an airspace develops at the top of the barrel, and that's where you begin to get the development of things that will produce vinegar and really ruin the taste. You also have to rack the wine to get it off of the sediment. And we racked wines, I think, 3 times during the first year. That's quite a job. When racking, you take the wine from the barrel that's full, put it into an empty barrel, leave the sediment behind, wash it out, then that barrel becomes the next one into which the wine from another barrel goes. So you do that 3 times a year. There's a lot of work. You bet there's plenty of hard work. And for those operations, we didn't have to have the full crew of the 10 of us out there. And we would get organized. We had a good safety rule. I think I was one who, with an employment law background, insisted on it, that no one go out there and work alone. Always have to be 2 people to work. And sometimes that's all it took. Sometimes, if we're going to be racking, we'd need larger crews, but we divide the work up and got through making wine that way.
I'm curious, did you, since you were all experienced wine tasters, did you taste at the various rackings and see?
Oh, you bet. Well, sure.
You did, didn't you?
Well, yeah, and of course, one of the things we wanted to do was hopefully to develop an expertise about how wine should taste at various periods as they age. And I don't think that I now could do it. But I think when I was much more involved in the actual making of the wine, I was on my way to being able to say that this one is going to be great and this one's all right. But it was a fascinating thing to see if you could do it. And people, those 10 vintners, wanted to do it.
There's a lot of confidence there, isn't it? Just trust in your own perceptions.
Well, of course
in
we
addition to
do.
the skill.
Yeah, well, but of course, as I said, we tasted each other's homemade wine before. And, you know, you get a little bit superior about it. Some of us knew who should not be out there alone, or which two should not be out there alone. And we arranged things that way. I think one of the things I should mention to indicate what state Washington wine was in at the time we started is that though there were those good grape varieties over there, they were, as I said, overcropped, that is much too much produced per acre. And what's more, the local wineries just took them and threw them in with anything else of the same color. And my picture of it was that the local wineries then, they'd say, well, we've got enough claret, let's put on the Burgundy labels. And I don't think there was anything different in what they did. There was one of the wineries here that time, the manager of it was a Bible Belt Baptist. She wouldn't taste it. The reason why she got to be manager was that she was a bookkeeper. And she noticed that they were spending a lot of money for sugar to sweeten up and fortify the wines. And she also noticed that the sugar readings on the grapes that they were buying varied. And so she offered premium prices to farmers who brought in grapes with more sugar. And the owners thought she was so brilliant that she should, even though she was a Bible Belt Baptist and wouldn't taste the stuff, that she should run the winery. Well, when we when we had made our wines, we were quite pleased with the way they were coming along. We were not pleased with the Pinot Noir, but that wasn't because of the Pinot so much as because we had no air conditioning in that building at the beginning. We couldn't afford that. And we got a very, very hot spell right after we'd crushed it. And the temperature went up, and I was out there with Phil Church. We got the temperature in the fermenting casks, and it was getting up to 100 degrees. And that's terrible. You want to keep it down around 62, 64, something like that. And I remember Phil Church and I made a great search, and everybody's garden hoses had to be surrendered. And we took them in and hooked them up, put the hoses down in circle as coils down into the vats of the Pinot Noir, hooked the hose up to the cold water faucet, and at the very end, of course, to the drain, and we used that kind of a cooling system to bring the Pinot back down. But we didn't get to do that soon enough, so our 1967 Pinot Noir was a pretty thin Pinot and light in color.
Actually, the moonshiners use the same technique to cool their
No, really?
They put the coil in there. That's right.
Well, we knew that the reputation of Washington wine was terrible. I think it's accurate to say that at that time, anyone who knew anything about wine knew never buy a Washington wine. The wines that were made here were frankly produced for the Skid Road characters. They were largely fortified wines. They were not wines made with any delicacy or finesse. And so when we got our wines out at the vineyard and followed them along, we decided that we were going to wait 2 years before we sold a white and 4 years before we sold a red. And the reason why we did this was we did not want to put a wine on the market that would be raw so that people would taste it and say, oh, another horrible Washington wine. Now, waiting that long when you have very little capital is very hard to do. But we did it. I might, way of saying, hard to do when you don't have the capital. When we finally did sell wine, first in 1969, the first piece of equipment that we bought was a conveyor to lift the grapes up into the crusher. The way we had done it before, believe it or not, was that one person would stand on a stepladder up at near the top, the place where he could put the box, 35-pound box, 35 pounds of grapes, roughly, and probably 7 or 8 pounds of box, dump it into the hopper for the crusher, and the other person stand down below and you get that crate of grapes and hoist it up, and while it's still going, the man on the ladder get it and dump it in. That was pretty hard work. And the first piece of equipment we bought was a conveyor, so that we could get the grapes hauled up that way. But going back to the putting our wine on sale, this is again is the way this company succeeds. With all the people that we had of all the various talents. Phil Padelford is a businessman, a business investor and so on, and he had the appropriate contacts with the manager, with the president of QFC. And he arranged that QFC would market our first two whites, the Riesling and the Gewürztraminer. And not only that, take a lower markup on it than they did for other wines.
Unusual.
Yeah, and I remember being with the group that delivered the first batch of this wine to the QFC store in University Village. The manager of that store was named Pellegrini. No relationship to the university professor, winemaker, English teacher. And what I remember about him was that he greeted us civilly and all that, but there was you study nonverbal communication. There were certain movements that indicated less than enthusiasm about having to take these wines in. Well, one of the things I had done was to get in touch with Stan Reed, who wrote a gourmet column for the Seattle PI at that time. And I told him about us, and he asked him if I could bring him wine, and he said he'd come by here. So right down here in the basement of our house, I turned over sample bottles of the Gewürztraminer and the Riesling to him. And once again, if I'm any good at nonverbal communication, there was a certain look of amused detachment as he took the bottles. But he took them, and Stan Reed was so enthusiastic when he tasted those wines that in that first week he wrote 3 columns devoted to AV. And the first column that he wrote, I think, very accurately said, quite close to the beginning of it, it should still be posted out at Columbia Winery, a new industry has been born in Washington. And I think he was right. It was really a thrill to think that you were doing that.
Boy, the enthusiasm as well.
Oh, yeah. And then what happened, of course, was he dropped, Stan Reed mentioned where the wine could be sold, and there was a great run on the University Village QFC.
How long did it last?
Oh, it didn't last very long. Once I got out with only 3,000, in fact, that wouldn't be 3,000, it'd be a little over 1,500 gallons of white wine that we had to sell then. But the thing that I remember is with amusement is that we quickly sold out the wine that we had delivered, and so we had to make another delivery. And the look on Mr. Pellegrini's face when we came in that time was quite different. And it was a real pleasure. And he recognized that he'd gotten in his store, and this was the only QFC store that had this. He got something and was bringing people in who had been shopping elsewhere, and that marketing AV wine was a very good thing for him.
You've got an audience from the university too, didn't you?
Oh yeah, sure. It was a natural place. Our friends knew about it, and that was a nice place for them to go to shop and pick things up. They increased the sales there. The wine, I think, after the Stan Reed article came out, I think it came out in July, I think, the early part of July. I'm sure that by the middle of August there wasn't another bottle of AV wine available. And that's the way it went for about the first 7 or 8 years of our production. We would have sales out at the winery and then make deliveries. Ultimately, we were making deliveries to other stores too. But the wine would a total year's production would be gone by the end of August, or certainly by the middle of September.
As a competing wine salesman, I'm well aware of that, and you know, someone who shopped in that store.
Yeah.
It was a big event.
Yeah, it was.
A
Sure.
noted event when
Yeah,
the wines
that's
were
right.
released.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Nouveau Beaujolais or something.
Something like that, sure. Yeah. Well, it's a great excitement to get somebody saying who's knowledgeable, because what Stan Reed had written before certainly established that he knew wine. And when he said these were great wines, people, well, a great Washington wine, you got to prove it to me. And they wanted to go and get the test, and they apparently agreed it was.
Did you release any? No, you didn't release any reds.
No. We waited 4 years for the reds. Cabernet, when it's only 2 years old, is not really ready to be drunk. And one of the pities is that most of the people who go into our stores today don't have a wine storage cellar, and they pick up Cabernets that are just altogether too young. Most of the Cabernets, most of the Washington Cabernets would be much, much better if they were stored for about another 8 to 10 years. I've recently, at Christmas time, I opened one of the 67 Cabernet Sauvignon, and it was magnificent. It's just like a great French Bordeaux, and it's tremendous life.
Must thrill you to death.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I wish I had more of them down there, but not much. I guess I'd make one side trip on the development of the wine industry in Washington. 69 was the year that the so-called California Wine Bill was passed.
Sure, wait just a second.
Yeah.
You know, this kind of complex with 4 or 5 companies. Did they view you with disdain and detachment, or just before the bill was introduced?
Sure. Well, I think most of the Washington wine producers thought we were crazy, because they knew how to make their money making rock gut for Skid Road people. And I remember going with Phil Fidelford to a meeting of the Washington Wine and Grape Growers Council over in Yakima. This was before we marketed any of our wines. And they had, during the business meeting, a table with samples of their various kinds of wine out there in case anybody wanted to taste them. And then came the social hour. They packed all of that stuff up and put it away, and out came the bourbon, scotch, gin, and vodka. Those were the things that they would drink, not that stuff that had been out there on display. They thought we were kind of crazy. But 1969, the year we first sold our whites, was the year in which the so-called California Wine Bill was passed here. It was called that because California wineries wanted to be able to sell wine directly to grocery stores. The law before that time was very discriminatory. Out-of-state wine producers could not sell their wines, or a wholesaler could not, working for them, couldn't sell their wine to grocery stores. The grocery stores had to buy out-of-state wines and wines from Europe through the state liquor board and pay the same bottle price, same price per bottle, as a customer would pay walking into the state liquor store and buying it. Well, that, of course, didn't make for much in the way of sales of out-of-state wine in grocery stores. It gave a tremendous competitive advantage to the Washington wineries to sell what wine they had at a low price in those stores. And the California Wine Bill did away with that discrimination. And I remember that what we wanted to do, Associated Vintners wanted to do, is we wanted to have a tasting room at our winery. And the law then forbade that. The law then did allow breweries to have tasting rooms, but wineries could not. And so I drafted up a proposed bill to permit Washington wineries to operate tasting rooms. And I think it was Don Bevan and I went down to Olympia to speak at committee meetings. And we were very warmly greeted by the legislators because they knew they were doing something that was going to be viewed very unfavorably by vineyard owners and wineries in Washington. And the fact that somebody come in and suggested something they could do that would help the wineries to sell Washington wine was delightful. They really wanted to do that. And
The legislators.
yeah, sure. And that's when the law was changed. They didn't use exactly my draft, but the substance of it was adopted, and now Washington, since that time, Washington wineries have been able to have tasting rooms. And one of the things which I remember there, I think Sid Abrams was very amazed. He was in the hearing room at the time when one of the senators, I believe it was a senator, asked me if I weren't opposed to taking away the protection that Washington wineries had from foreign competition. And I told him truthfully, and I was thinking, a good part of being a consumer as well as being a producer, I said to him, no, not one bit. If we can't equal them or beat them, we don't deserve to be in the business. I think Sid Abrams just about fell out of his chair when he heard me say that, but you can check with him if you want, and I think he'll tell you the story pretty much the way that I've just told you. And so that's what we got. I guess the next thing to say is we developed and sold our reds, and Cabernet was 4 years old, isn't old enough, but it was not a harsh wine, and so the sales kept going. Then about 1972, 73, maybe it was even 74, we decided we were going to have to expand our winery. In this 40 by 40 foot building, we couldn't make enough wine. We couldn't expand the production that much. And so we left Parmac Industrial Park. You know, in the landlord and tenant law, there's a concept of which is called ameliorative waste. It's when the tenant makes an improvement in the building that the landlord doesn't know about. Mm-hmm. And when we turned that building back to Parmac Industrial Park, there were no complaints. It was very ameliorative. But they found out that we didn't have just 40 feet by 40 feet at ground level. We had about another 40 feet by 25 or 30 feet in the mezzanine that we built. And once again, it was the stockholders did it. I put nails in, and everybody else was out there pounding nails, putting in the floor, developing it. And you have, as I said, people like Al Taylor, and Don Bevan's very good at carpentry and things of that sort. And we put it in a very solid mezzanine in that building. But it still wasn't enough. So we, again, went around and checked things out, and we found a building over in Redmond that was under development, and made arrangements to buy a space big enough to produce 20,000 gallons of wine a year instead of the 3.5 to 4,000 gallons of wine we've been making in Parmac Industrial Park.
Was Lloyd Woodburn retired by this time? Or?
Yes, Lloyd Woodburn had retired before we moved from Parmac Industrial Park. I think he had retired for at least 1 year of operations at Parmac and was going to be the manager for this 20,000 gallon matter. And he and Charles Schleicher and I think we were the prime people. Phil Church was involved, but we did a job this time with the person who's going to put up the building to have that place fitted out better for winemaking, such things as the troughs that would be put in the floor for drainage. And so we could do a wash down the floor and clean things up. We've learned quite a bit. The separating a bottling area to keep the alien molds or spores from getting into bottles while we're bottling. We worked things out that way. And that's where we operated for quite a few years. That's when we made that change. No, it was before that time. It was when we were still out at the Parmac. Part of our desire to expand and buy more land, we wanted to, and we did buy another vineyard, which we named Church Vineyard. A little southeast of, I guess mainly east of Sunnyside, a much bigger one, and we planted that. And for that we needed more capital. And for that, the 10 of us brought in 2 new stockholders, Willard Wright of the Davis Wright law firm, and Pete Ron, who's a stockbroker. And they invested enough capital so that we were able to buy and develop that new vineyard. And that new vineyard coming into production was one of the things that made us know we had to move and get into the enlarged winery.
Were you buying any grapes by this time, or were you using?
No, at this time we were still using all our own.
Really, an estate winery at that point.
We liked it that way. I would say all of the time that Bill Barnard managed things for us, because he did an excellent job. After that, we began to have problems with getting vineyard managers who would pay enough attention to our vineyards, because our vineyards were always their second concern. Mm-hmm. And if you're a farmer, you pay attention to your crop first, mm-hmm. and then look to the other. And things didn't go well that way.
Were they raising grapes too?
Oh, some of them did. Some of them raised other crops. Mm-hmm. One of our misadventures with one of the managers was that he pruned back our vines for us. He pruned them back so much that the next year we got only about 1/3 of the crop that we normally would get. And he took the cuttings, took what he cut off of our vines back to his farm and planted them as grape cuttings, which he would sell. I wanted to sue him, and in fact we did retain a lawyer over there, but I guess the other Associated Vintners were less litigious than I am, so some kind of a settlement was worked with it. They were afraid that we would get the reputation of being big city oppressors of a poor farmer in the Yakima Valley, and they're real hazards about doing that. But I would say the one thing that, much as I disliked that experience, one thing that it really did persuade me was that we were still overcropping the Chardonnay, because the Chardonnay that we made that year, after they'd been pruned back some, was just so magnificent. You pull the cork in the room the size of our dining room, and within a very short time, it's just like perfume had come out. It was just tremendous. And it's a hard thing for vineyards to do, a hard thing for grape growers to do, but, and I suppose also it's kind of hard for the people who sell the Chardonnay to sell it at the price you have to get if you're going to cut it back that much. But it's, I think that year certainly proved that in quality you get the return.
It's a labor-intensive kind of viticulture too, vinifera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, your managers perhaps might not have wanted to put the same amount of effort, or put the same amount of effort they might in a Concord or something.
Oh yeah. Well, that's another thing that's happened since, and now Columbia Winery buys its grapes. But one of the reasons why you couldn't really buy grapes when we first started was that the farmers looked at us as a bunch of crazy professors. 6 of us were professors at the University of Washington, 4 were business people. You know, we tell them, well, we don't want any more than 5 tons to an acre. You're crazy. I can produce much more than that. And in addition, we want it to have 23% sugar. You're crazy. You can sell it to Welch's anytime at 18. And you just wouldn't, the farmers were not used to the demands that would be made for producing good wine grapes. And that certainly changed. The farmers over in the Yakima Valley now know that they're not crazy professors. This is what wine takes, and that making wine is something different from making Welch's grape juice.
But you had a lot of personal experience, all 10 of you,
Yeah.
in true viticultural practices. Obviously, you'd read and you'd tried.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well,
You were not without experience. You weren't.
But no, but the farmers, you know, farmers, I suppose many times they got reason for thinking city people, and particularly professors, who are not professors at Washington State. Maybe if we had been professors at Washington State, they might have believed us. But from the University of Washington, no.
None of them would have been that friendly.
No. So I've got an amusing story to tell you about being crazy professors, and that is that one year there was a drought, and the birds migrating south in the fall changed their routes, and they discovered, lo and behold, there were all these nice grapes down there.
Right about harvest time.
Yeah, and they went down, and if you get 5,000 robins descending on your vineyard, they can eat an enormous amount of your crop in a short time. And we lost a lot that first time, and I guess the birds had learned about it, and they were going to use it the second time too. And we prepared, thought about what we could do, and one of the things that we learned the French had done, supposedly to work, is get French netting. We got French netting, and you put it all over the vines as the grapes are maturing. Make sure that the birds can't just fly down. No, the birds are pretty smart. They just get down on the ground, walk in, go up and eat. Yeah. You're supposed to combine that with another way of dealing with the birds, and that was, I think this was also a French substance. You look for the very first grapes that got ripe. Dose them in this stuff. It wouldn't kill the birds, but it would make them very sick. We're supposed to persuade them not to eat the grapes. And birds are too smart for that. People, you know, at many places, people have tried to use these automatic cannons or guns that fire every once in a while. The birds get to know that. They go and sit on the darn guns and get off just before it's going to go off. They're not frightened by that. But the thing we did learn was that a person down in Oregon, one of the developing wineries down there, had dealt with the problem by getting what are called German hawk kites. And a hawk kite is clear plastic with just the silhouette of a hawk in black on it. And the technique is that you get an atmospheric balloon, fill it with helium, attach about 50 feet of line between the balloon and the kite, and then let it go, let the kite go up and hang it over your vineyard. And we gave those to the then manager, not Barnard, a different person, manager of our vineyard. And once again, my suspicion is he thought, crazy professors, but I'll do it, you're paying me. And And he called me up one morning and told me that I guess it was the Pinot had gotten ripe, and he said the birds were in on it. So he said, I took your kites over and sent one up in the air. And I stood there and watched, and not a bird flew out. And I thought, he said, it was just like I thought, no good at all. And then I saw the birds were walking out. He said the birds walked right straight down under the grapevines to the bottom of the hill where there was a drainage ditch. And he said then they packed up there like people busy at a bus stop or something until they got pushed off. And then they go down and fly low along the roadway until they got a good distance away. Yeah. Well, and another part of that story is that a person from the Washington State Agricultural Experimental Station at Prosser came over to see how this was working, because cherry growers and others, not just grape growers, have problems with birds. And he told us that he'd driven up and looked at our operation. I should back up just a little bit and say one of the things that the kite system worked well, but one of the things that troubled us was the number of them that got destroyed. We'd find them on the ground all smashed up and the balloon broken, and we were thinking, those darn kids over there with their guns practicing shooting down our kites and the balloons. Well, this person from the Prosser Experimental Station told us that he looked at our system and thought it was dandy. And he was just about to get back in his car again when he said, I saw a real hawk come and went swoosh right by your kite. And then back up in the air again, and he made the turns a couple of times, looked at the balloon and the kite, and he went up and came down and punctured the balloon. And then he came down and he grabbed your kite and he savaged it all the way down to the ground and left it there in a mess. And that's just the one hawk, not going to have anything looking like him in the area. And that's it wasn't the kids that were shooting down our kites. It was a hawk.
Do they still use that today?
I don't know if they have to. I suppose a good part of it is what's the bird migration pattern now. But I'm sure that if the problem arises, there are now people who are persuaded that that's what you do. This is one of the things you learn. I mentioned, say, back in '65, when the vines, 64 to 65, when the vines froze. Well, we asked about it, learned that some places it hadn't happened. Why did we get cursed this way? Well, it turned out that, I'm not faulting Barnard, he was a very good person, but I guess because he thought they were new vines, he had irrigated quite late in the year, so there was moisture in the soil. Our operating rule became after that, no irrigation after August, after the first part of August. We want to let that soil dry out. There'll be enough moisture to take the grapes through to maturity, but then if there is a hot day, there won't be enough moisture in the soil for the vines to pull it up. And you don't suffer that kind of destruction. That's one difference between the Yakima Valley and the Napa Valley, and that is you have to have much greater concern about winter damage up here than you do down in the Napa Valley. And in that same respect, a number of years later, we had another winter in which over there the temperatures were down below zero for well over a week. But the worst thing was that there was no snow on the ground. And all of the vineyards suffered, particularly the one that we had, newly developed one that we had, the one we called Church Vineyard, suffered tremendously. And yet you look around and there are some places where people's vines hadn't suffered. They didn't have snow. Why didn't they get root damage the way that we got? Well, you learn that for one reason or another, some people late in the year, for they had irrigated very lightly, just got a little bit of moisture on the top of the soil. And what happened then is, for them, when that deep freeze developed, that top soil froze hard, and it was a protective cover. And the ground down below didn't freeze, and the roots didn't get damaged. So, chalk up one more lesson. You have got the way to avoid some of the dangers of the killing frosts or freezes that occur sometimes over there in the Yakima Valley.
Had either you guys or Barnard, your manager, made contact with Walter Clore by this time?
Oh, sure, yes, of course.
So you
Yeah.
had
Walter
no
Clore was very great help on giving advice on the growing of vines, and yes, tremendous help. He's a very knowledgeable person. You know, one of the greats in the producing Washington wine industry. In a way, he's younger than Bridgman was, but I think Bridgman is really a monumental character in the development of the Washington wine industry, because if it hadn't been for him, we probably would not, well, it would have taken us a lot longer to find out what we needed to know. And so Bridgman was a real character. His son-in-law, I remember, told me one time about being worried about him because he would drive his car as he got older, and he'd come to a stop sign, and I don't mean a stop light, I mean a stop sign. And his son-in-law said, he'll sit there and he'll say, 6 cars is enough. And out he'd go. He obviously survived. He didn't die in an automobile accident. That's the kind of
the law says.
well, that's the kind of spirit that you take, I guess, that sort of enterprising spirit of going to plant vinifera here and see what they do. And as I understand it, he at one time did produce a very good Riesling at the Santa Rosa Winery with the assistance of a winemaker who came from Germany. And I don't know the details of it, or why the German winemaker left, but I guess he only stayed there long enough to make a very small quantity of wine and then gave up.
This event, I recall.
And I don't,
in
good.
history books of the time, the early time.
Yeah.
But you were kind of fulfilling Walter Clore's dream in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't have the resources to put that many
That's right.
cultivation
Yes.
in a proper
Yeah,
manner.
that's right. Yeah, sure. And then he was, I think, delighted to have some people finally producing wine and trying to make it the right way. I think that at that point, Walter Clore was much more involved in the growing of the grapes and didn't know that much about winemaking, but he soon associated somebody with him who became a winemaker. And Walter Clore is one of the things which Walter Clore wanted to develop, has been a strong advocate of, is the Lemberger, which I think does make a good red wine.
Made in Lemberger's first?
No, we have not. I've never made it at home here, but I bought it, and I think it is a good red wine. I guess I'm like the people I've complained about who buy Cabernets and drink them too soon. I've never really let a Lemberger age enough. And one of the problems with it is its name. I mean, people just don't think something with a name like that can be a good wine.
Yes, but it's not as robust in character and style as the
No.
Cabernets, though.
No, it isn't, no. But it's a very nice wine, and I suppose
That was my first.
well, I might compare it to something like the relationship between Zinfandel and Pinot Noir, or Zinfandel, or maybe even Cabernet Sauvignon. It's
That was my impetuous recommendation of Walter Clore 20 years ago. Just change the name. It was a pretty good wine, but it's never going to sell as Lemberger.
No, that's right.
It never has.
No, the spelling isn't the same as the cheese, but it's close enough so that it bothers a lot of people. Well, I guess that's about the
Well,
the total of
take it
what
this-
occurs to me to tell you about.
Well, let's keep going here, because then you were still managers of vineyards,
Yeah.
and you took another step
And
when you either incorporated, or you were already incorporated.
we were incorporated, yeah.
When you
Moved to Bellevue.
moved to Bellevue, and then
That was when it was apparent that Lloyd Woodburn was a psychologist at the university. He was not a business manager, and he wasn't, and he's not a salesperson either. And when you get around to producing 20,000 gallons of wine, you got into a kind of an awkward stage in terms of marketing it. You can't just do as we did at Parmac Industrial Park, open up for a couple of weekends and expect that everybody's going to come and buy up all your wine and it'll all be sold by the end of September. We had to distribute wines, and that's when we looked for a new manager, and that's when Dan Beatty, who's now president of the winery, joined us to be our manager. And then we made the move to Bellevue with a very considerable expansion. Once again, at that time, I think we were ready to make up to 50,000 gallons of wine. And that was also required an enormous amount of investment.
that you would have got into the late 70s then, would you, or something?
Yes, and that's even the 80s now.
Okay. David Lake was, I think, came in.
Oh, David Lake came when we were at Redmond, and I think he maybe joined us in '77 to work with Lloyd as a winemaker.
Was he, in your memory, entranced by the possibility of those red wines?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. Yeah, so he knew what we could make. I mean, he got to taste it. We have I think they still have a wine library out there, and they save the wines samples in H1 over a long period of time. I'll tell you a sexist story that I don't think you're going to want to put on tape, but I'll get.
If you don't want to.
No, well, you can cut it out. But,
It's good. We want to hear it.
well, this is one of the times when we were still at Parmac Industrial Park, and we used to go out and have wonderful lunches in the sunlight with many bottles of wine and so on. And one time we had Stan Reed, who was then a friend of ours. We invited him out, and for Stan Reed to come out while we went back and got out the old wines from the library, and one of them was the 67 Gewürztraminer. And I remember people sitting around sniffing the wine, sipping it and tasting it, and they were saying, this is it's still all right, but it's beginning to show its age. It started downhill, and everybody, mainly I suppose the vintners, saying things condemning the wine a bit. And Stan Reed was there sniffing it and sipping it, and after he listened to us long enough, he put his glass down and he said, yes, but it's sort of like having Sophia Loren slip into bed with you.
There's a long downhill slide.
Yeah, that's right. You may want to use that for a little joke in your thing or not. But,
we don't know who's going to edit this at what time.
Yeah.
But at least it's archived.
well, I don't think that's not hard on Stan Reed, and I don't think there's a great feminist movement now, and I teach employment discrimination law, and I guess maybe that's made me much more aware of how easy it is to offend women with stories like that. But it seems to me it's still a cute one.
Well, also, no, let me ask you another question. Are most of you still involved as stockholders in the Columbia Corporation? Or the
yeah.
Corporation?
Yeah.
In other words, you're still there, and you got...
Yeah, well, Phil Church and his wife died, so their stock has gone to his children, and but he's the only one who doesn't have the original stock. Maybe I should tell you a little bit more about Phil Church. We had a wonderful...
I've got all their names here, and I was going to make sure before we're through that you had mentioned them all.
Of the original 10, 2 of them were brothers, the Lieber brothers, and they had an ink manufacturing company here in Seattle. I think they've now sold it, but they made very, very high quality inks, precision inks. And again, now we got 2 more people with a chemical background to help us with problems that come up, and also help us with problems about, well, what kind of labels we should get and where we should, what kind of ink we should insist on the labels and things of that sort. This is part of what I mean, is we had a group that you didn't have to go and hire an expert. There was somebody there who knew what to do.
You really had what might be termed a brain trust.
Yeah,
another way, but
yeah, and a wonderful thing to get that many people with different disciplines and training brought together because of their interest in winemaking.
I'd hazard to say that in my experience, and I know a lot about a lot of wineries, I don't know of any where that many people were intimate in its operation.
That's probably unusual, very unusual.
Probably unique in the world, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I would think so. They're usually just 1 or 2 people or a family operation, that's right. Let me mention my dear departed friend Phil Church. He was, I would say, my model of a curmudgeon. He's just a terrific guy. But he liked to argue. And
Should have been a lawyer.
well, he could argue enough without being a lawyer. But for example, I remember being with him one time when we got the renewed license from the Washington State Liquor Control Board. And Phil hated bureaucracy and government, etc. And the instruction said that the license was to be displayed on the winery presence under glass. I walked away and put it down on the table. I came back, and there's Phil, and he's got the license rolled up into a little roll, and he's going to stick it into a clear Semillon bottle. Put it out that way, so he can say he's got it displayed in the winery under glass. I told Phil that's not what they had in mind. We do have a picture frame here. There was a senior inspector from the alcohol and tobacco tax people who came out to inspect us when we were first starting. And he was a thoroughgoing bureaucrat. I remember him saying to me, looking at our plans, well, where are you going to keep your sugar? I said, we're not going to use any sugar. He said, no reason why you can't. I said, well, we're not going to. And I said, well, then how much water are you going to put in your wine? I said, we're not going to put any water in our wine. He said, no reason why you can't. You have absolutely no idea of the agency that regulates the wine industry in the nation, of anything about preserving quality. Well, this inspector was out there with Phil Church and another, I've forgotten who the other person was. Phil Church was the one who stands out. We had labeled all of the barrels as we were required, 69.5 gallons and 50 gallons. And this inspector looked at the 69.5 gallon barrels and said, how do you know it's 69.5 gallons? And Phil Church was the kind of person who would have done this. And Phil said to him, I filled a barrel with water, took it out and measured it, and that's what it was. And that's what, if you convert from the metric system to our gallons, that's what it should be, and the test proved it. And the inspector was not quite satisfied with this. He said, yeah, but you only did that with one. How do you know about all the rest of them? And Phil said to him, well, you know, how many do you think might be bigger than this one? And the inspector said, well, I don't know. So Phil said to him, well, how many do you think might be smaller than this one? The inspector said, well, I don't know. Phil said, "Do you think it might be about the same number for both?" And it wasn't until then that the inspector realized that he'd been trapped. And so Phil and the others did not have to measure with water every one of those barrels. And this inspector was one, I think I was there at the time, and he came around and he was going to check on these barrels. And he took out a tape measure made of ordinary steel. They pulled it out and he stuck it down into the barrel. And Bill Church yelled at him, "Get that out of there!" Because one of the worst things you can do is expose plain metal to wine. The wine has an acid, it will immediately attack the metal. And one of the things you spend your time in doing in a winery is making sure that wine does not come in contact with any metal other than maybe a stainless steel is all right. You put wine in stainless steel tanks, but you got to have that quality of steel. This inspector didn't know that. He jumped a bit and pulled away his tape and said he'd have to measure it some other way. And I guess Church got him a wooden stick and let him stick it into the depth and come out and measure that. He was a great guy. As I said, one of my fond memories of him is the last time I talked to him. And we used to sell wine to stockholders, terms a little bit different from what we sold to the public. And Phil, and for some of them we had to put our limit on how many stockholders could buy. And Phil was visiting a daughter down in California, but he called me, and I think he was calling me from California, could have been from his home in Bellevue, but what he wanted to do was complain about the note that he gotten about the sale to the stockholders, and that it was ambiguous. And first I tried to mollify him by agreeing with him. But yeah, a better job could have been done in writing this. And he just kept going on, and finally I realized that's not what Phil wants. Phil wants me to disagree with him. So I obliged him and said that despite what I said, it still thought it was good enough and that. So we had a nice little argument about that. And that, unfortunately, was the last time I talked to the guy. But that's why I say... That's why I say he was a real curmudgeon, too. But a wonderful guy, beautiful guy.
Well, what's remarkable in sitting here listening to this story is how intimately they were all, many of them at least, were involved in the day-to-day operations.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Yes. Well, yes, it was a hands-on thing for all of us. Charles Schleicher, being a chemical engineer, was very, very much concerned about a number of things. I know he, well, at his retirement party at the university, his son said I could tell this story, so I guess I can tell you. And that's how he got to be named SO2 Charlie. SO2 is the chemical that you start with first when you crush the grapes, put it in a small quantity, and it kills all the alien yeasts and molds, so that when you inoculate it with your chosen yeast, then you get the fermentation that you want, undisturbed by anything that was on the grapes. And then you use SO2 other times. If any mold seems to be developing in a barrel, a little bit of SO2 on the top will take care of that. And Schleicher always wanted to be sure that we had SO2 that was up to the right quantities and so on. And he did a very good job, and he was extremely valuable in this respect. But one of the problems you have is with empty barrels, barrels without wine, is that if you fill them with water, then you really do get this problem of mold developing. And Charles wanted to try a new way of dealing with this, and so he filled the barrel with SO2. And that would keep any mold from developing. Well, that was dandy. until the time we were out there working, and the time came we needed the barrel. And clean barrel. Started to put the liquid in, and then what Charles hadn't really thought through all the way was the fact that the wine was going to displace the SO2, and the SO2 therefore was going to have to go out. And it went out. And if you've ever had an asthma attack, you know what SO2 can do to you if you breathe it. It really just constricts your lungs and bronchi and so on. And boy, Charlie emptied the winery very, very promptly. We all ran out. And the doors opened and waited until we could get back in. And that's when he got the name, sometimes affectionately directed to him, being SO2 Charlie.
Yeah, you could die very easily with the...
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that Warren Bierman is a specialist in child allergies at the University Hospital. And when we were talking about SO2 on other occasions, he mentioned the old Tacoma smelter. And before environmental laws began to affect the operation of the Tacoma smelter, as I understand it, that stack turned out 20 tons of SO2 per hour. They just way up high, but it went out in the atmosphere. And Warren Bierman said that if you wanted to track the residences of children who died of asthma, you had the Tacoma plume trail from that smelter.
Interesting. Obviously yours is a success story, but one of the questions is, what did you not accomplish? What that you had in mind? Did this fulfill your original dreams and objectives?
Well, one of mine is that I'm not making wine anymore.
I see.
I'd like to be out there making it. But employees don't like to have stockholders show up and take up their overtime.
Totally professional operation?
Yeah, that's right. And I'd like to be much more involved in it. That's the real fun. It's nice to see the sales go and things of that sort. Nice to talk about it. But the real fun is to be out there making it. And
have you not? Are all of you out of the making of wine now?
I don't think anybody's making wine now.
Well, I want you to say that in here.
Okay.
Millennium was one of the first really presumptive kind of moves by David Lake, wasn't it, to say that I'm making a wine that can live for 25 years or 20 years or something of that nature?
Well, I'm not sure everybody at Columbia will like me for saying this, but the labels on that wine were first AV.
Tell me about this.
They all got taken off and replaced with Columbia when the name of the winery was changed.
Tell me this is about Millennium, because I mean, again,
It's a great wine. And '79 was an exceptionally good year. The Yakima Valley is a desert, and we don't have to worry about rain in the fall spoiling a vintage. But there are differences in what the temperature was and what the growth is. And some years turn out to be better than others. And the '79, apparently everything was just beautiful, both for the Cabernet and for the Pinot Noir, much better for the Cabernet. And yeah, David Lake can tell this is part of his being a master of wines. His judgment is that the wine is going to get better and better. This is part of what I said I was trying to develop as we made wine, the ability to predict what this wine is going to turn into. And I think David's judgment is very reliable, and the Millennium will be that. In terms of it lasting that long, well, I told you about my '67 Cabernet that I opened this Christmas. I don't have any doubt that Cabernet can last that long.
I think David's made that same comment too, that it'll just be beginning to mature by the turn of the century.
Yeah.
Do you look at this area over there being one of the great red wine producing countries? I mean, areas of the world? I mean, in the reputation of the Bordeaux or the Napa Valley or that sort of thing?
I don't have much doubt that it will be that for the Cabernet. I'm not going to make that kind of a prediction for the Pinot Noir. And I think it may be that for Merlot. Merlot is so much like Cabernet, it ought to do that. As you know, the traditional blend in the Bordeaux region is about 1/3 Merlot and 2/3 Cabernet Sauvignon, but in places like Saint-Emilion, it's reversed, 2/3 Merlot, 1/3 Cabernet. Merlot is put in, I think, largely because it matures more rapidly. And in that respect, I'd say, for the persons buying a bottle of Washington wine, if they don't have a cellar to let the Cabernet mature in, probably the Merlot is the better wine to purchase. It's quite a bit like a Cabernet, but it will have aged more rapidly and therefore be, generally speaking, a better wine. We've had some really great Pinot Noirs, and if we could only figure out exactly what it was that happened that year, it would be better. First thing we do know is that the Oregon territory seems to produce a better Pinot Noir than we get in the Yakima Valley. That suggests that it's something of a little bit cooler growing season is what's needed to produce the really good Pinot Noir. One of the things we haven't done enough of in this state yet is to experiment with the microclimates in different parts of the state to find out which variety grows best in that microclimate. And they do differ a great deal. You can go along the Yakima Valley and it changes a great deal. Phil Church said that our vineyards at Sunnyside were very much like the Burgundy and the Bordeaux regions. But he said when we got down to the Tri-Cities area, it's much closer to Italy. It's hotter down there during the day, and at night it doesn't cool off as much. If you want to look at the local newspapers during the summer, look at the temperatures in Yakima. They're regularly reported, and you'll see that frequently the temperature in Yakima during the day will go up to 90, 93, 95 degrees. At night, 62, sometimes 59. That's that cold air comes rushing down out of the mountains, and when it hits the upper part and the middle part of the Yakima Valley, it can cool it off. But by the time it gets down below, it doesn't have that same cooling effect. Well, that means you study different places, and you've got obviously a difference for where the slopes are. I've looked sometimes when I've been driving over in eastern Washington and looked at the Columbia River Gorge, and you see flat land down in different places, and see somewhere there'd be a nice shield behind to bake, so on. I just thought, you know, there ought to be experimental plots of grapes in all kinds of these places to see which varieties do best and can do well in this area. And we haven't done that. The Europeans have been doing this for a couple thousand years, and that's why they know with great certainty which variety should be grown where.
It leads me to a question of Warren Magnuson about 20 years ago, about the time you were had a study commission through the Federal Agriculture Department. And I think that the figure was something close to 200,000 acres for potential for raising vinifera in eastern Washington. In your wildest dreams now, do you see a couple of 100,000 acres, 11,000 now? I mean, what do you foresee?
Yes, I think it can go to that. But tell me what the acreage is in California.
About
Well,
35 now.
I don't know why we can't have every bit. If we've got the land for quality, we'll do it. And I can tell you what, this is how exuberant I was when we were out there at the winery. I used to give sort of a cheering call to the people working, and that is when we have finished, we will reduce the Californians to raising raisins. Napa raisins will always sell at a premium, but that's what Washington is going to do. I don't, obviously, it's an exaggeration, but in terms of my confidence about what can develop here, yeah, I think we can go that great. If you, I'm just telling you other crazy things that we do, partly to relieve the tedium of the dull work of bottling and corking is not the most fascinating thing. But you remember there was a great wine scandal when one of the prestigious French, not wineries, the merchants who, negociants, was found to, the French inspector coming through got a bit suspicious when he saw a tank that had on it, maybe sold for a Beaujolais in the United States. He said, I want the documentation on this wine and where do these grapes come from? And of course, totally lacking. And someone tasted it and thought, well, we can sell this to the Americans as Beaujolais. And so I put up a sign on one of ours out there, and I named it as something that could be sold. Let's see, which one did I have? Picked one of them, and anyhow said it could be sold as a chateau, something in Belgium. You know, hoping to have an inspector come through and check on this.
You have mentioned obliquely a couple of times the state of Washington, but differentially, were they cooperative with you all the way through?
Yeah. Well,
The liquor board officials?
The liquor board officials were very good. You know, one of the things you learn, and of course, maybe this is one of the things that helped, being a lawyer and a law school professor, and having taught administrative law, I knew the way you get along with an administrative agency is to be open, above board, and tell them everything, and no fudging on anything. And that's the way we went, and I guess they recognized it, and we've had no trouble with the State Liquor Control Board. As a matter of fact, when the California Wine Bill came in, one of the things that was done was to put in a grandfathering clause so that while wineries to be founded later would not be permitted to sell their wines directly to retail outlets, those that were in existence would be able to do that. And the State Liquor Control Board people got in touch with me, and we rushed through the papers so that then Associated Vintners, now Columbia, could be grandfathered. So unlike the newer wineries that would not be permitted to sell, because of the statement, because of the requirement of law, they would not be permitted to sell to a retail outlet, but AV, Columbia, I haven't checked the law recently, but I'm pretty sure that it's still grandfathered. San Michel wouldn't be grandfathered that way because it's the descendant of Nowico Pomerel.
It should be, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be, sure.
I don't think they do it, and of course, your wholesaler doesn't like it very much if you do that.
Too much, no. How about other people that you've covered all of your particular company that you see? We mentioned Walter Clore as an example, and Bourbon. So just throw out.
Well, we've got a group of people, I'd say, for example, Myron Redford, who manages and I guess owns Amity Vineyard, used to work with us. I think there are a number of people got training working with us as our operation got bigger.
I was thinking in terms of other people like Alec Bayless or others who...
Oh, Alec Bayless. Well, Alec Bayless, of course, was interested in the grape production and not in wine production. No, I will tell you this, I'm very pleased to this. As you know, Alec Bayless died this year, maybe it was before Christmas, But his partner, Ken McDonald, in the ceremonies for him, I was very flattered. Ken McDonald looked out at the audience and said that it was in my basement, in Peck's basement, that Alec Bayliss became interested in producing grapes, because he came here and I was so enthusiastic about what the future of the Washington wine industry was going to be. That's the time when Alec decided he'd go back and start and develop the vineyards over there, which he did very well.
That's what I was getting at here, was other people that you may have brought into or influenced positively outside of your own circle of investors.
Well, I don't know. There'd be a lot of them you wouldn't know. Allison, for example, has got, you know, no, not Victor Allison, a different Allison, the one who's got a winery over in Prosser, I think it is. Should we stop and do that over? I'll go back and say.
Okay.
There's an Allison father and son group that have a winery over, I think, at Prosser, and I'm not sure the name of the winery, maybe Allison, but we got to know them when they were the people who trucked our grapes over for us. And they came over and they thought the winemaking looked like fun and wine tasted good and so on, and since I think we were instrumental in getting them into making wine. Excuse me, let's cut for a minute. Gloria's brought
Up these questions that I think you covered most of them on this list. Naturally, legislative and regulatory, we talked about that. Who, from your observation, were the biggest?
in terms of people out of state who did great things for the Washington wine industry. Telesjeff is the most important one that I can think of. And he came up to be a consultant to Nauico Palmarel when they were developing what now is Saint Michel wines. And while he was here, he came out to see our winery, similar one in Parmac Industrial Park, and he was very excited. Our Cabernet had gone into the malolactic fermentation, and he was just about dancing around on the floor to see that taking place. And then he had a late plane back to California. So Phil Church invited him to Church's home. And there are slightly different versions of this story, but basically the one I'm going to tell you is accurate. And that is Church served Telesjeff a wonderful salmon dinner, and with it a bottle of his homemade Gewürztraminer. That's how long ago it was. And Telesjeff sampled it and then said something to the effect of, "All right, Dr. Church, stop trying to fool me. From what Alsatian vineyard did this wine come?" You know, he learned it was Washington. I think that's when Telesjeff went back down to California and told him, "You got something developing up there. It's going to be great."
He that also must have encouraged Church to keep on his path.
Oh yeah, well sure, yes. Well,
International
but Church knew he made good wine. He made great wine. You know, some of it is
We
just.
like people to recognize our children.
Yes, that's right. Well, some of it though is just how much are you devoted to it. Is that some of the most simple things about winemaking are that you've got to avoid exposing it to metal, and you've got to avoid exposing it to the air. And particularly when it's fermenting, you have to have a bubbler system that lets the gas out but doesn't let the atmosphere in. Then after that, you have to check the barrels to make sure that they stay full, that the airspace doesn't develop. And it depends on how much you like it. If you like it enough, you do it once a week just to check and make sure everything is under control. If it's not that big a thing in your life, well, then maybe you let it go 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe even a month, and you go down and say, "Holy Christopher, this bubbler's been empty." you're not going to get good wine. You may end up with a wine that's tolerable, but you're not going to have it right up to the best of quality.
Once a month it was the regular practice in California. Not to disparage California wines, but I think they topped off monthly. That was
Well, maybe so.
that's why it struck me when you said you did it every week.
Well, as I told you, maybe, I don't know if they do it that often now out at Columbia, but when we started, we knew what the reputation of Washington wines was, and we knew what we were going to have to do if we were going to produce a wine that would be accepted.
How large is your production now at Columbia?
You better check with David Lake, but I think it's probably getting close to 150,000 gallons.
So it'd clearly be the second largest winery in the state, and probably Hogue Cellars or one of those.
Well, Hogue is mighty big now, too. San Michel would be first.
Right.
Hogue may be bigger than us. But I don't have those figures.
One last comment that I'm just curious about. You left the vineyard operations or estate bottling probably for economic reasons as much as anything else.
That's right. During the
Are you
time.
satisfied with that move? I mean, now...
Yes, now the farmers believe us when they say what we want. And David Lake's got a wonderful working relationship with the vineyards that supply Columbia, and now it works out all right. It was because of the interest rates that we had to sell the vineyards. We had engaged in this expansion. We had fairly sizable loans from the bank, but when the interest rate gets up to 19%, it is just absolutely unbearable. And sell your children. That's what we did, and we sold our vineyards. And I didn't like to, but I had to get some money to avoid that interest charge.
You certainly be congratulated for the perspicacity and the vision that you had.
Well, there was also just love of making it.
Well, it's a pleasure to have interviewed you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions come to mind, or any statements that any other funny things that you...
Maybe tonight, but I'll remember something.
I'll tell you.
I think.
I'll tell you funny thing.
Okay.
He would check the wine every night when he came home. It was right down below this room here.
Mm-hmm.
And every night he'd just go around and feel it and look at it, talk to it, just like. And my theory was that the yeast that was produced down below this room just seeped up, and that all of us, the children, were raised with this
The near penicillin.
natural yeast that comes off of wine, right? Coming through the floorboards.
Well,
It doesn't do that, you know, it does grow.
sure.
In the
Yeah.
Chateau of Europe, it grows all
I
over the
don't mean
place.
that to be on tape, but I just
No,
thought it's so interesting
that's
that
right.
wine was really, literally,
Yeah.
in our front, right under our feet.
That's what makes it so shameful.
No, speaking of our children, I guess it's an idea of how much they knew wine meant to me when children are searching around because they want to say something that lets you know that how angry they've gotten. One of them said to me one time, "Nobody likes your wine." She was a little girl at the time, but I mean, she knew where to strike.
Yeah. That's what makes it, it's such a shame today, and that's what my mission is to get the government out of the business of condemning this product and linking it with drugs. I will not die before I down the government. And so we must all together treat wine and other kind of forms of what they are.
I think an awful lot of the requirements, people are urging that still more be put on bottles of what the ingredients
yes,
are. Those are a good part of that is prohibitionists who want to make it look like it's so dangerous.
I'll give you a free copy of my magazine, because it comes out every 2 months, and that's what I do. I'm trying to organize a recalcitrant industry to fight for its own integrity.
Yeah.
And it doesn't want to do it.
No.
There's too many other considerations in the litigious world that we live in.
Yeah,
Well, let's not have this on. No, this is vital chatter. Thank you so much for the time and effort.
yeah. Well, it's the same thing that made me get into it.